My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is justified nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
In my prior presentations on this topic, I have discussed why I argue that Jesus' mythicism should not be considered as the inference to the best explanation, why I feel it can be classified as a conspiracy theory, the fact that the Ferrer hypothesis is as much of a hypothesis as is Q, or the two-source hypothesis, not established fact, and some of the issues that I have with Dr. Richard Carrier's argumentation in his book on the historicity of Jesus, namely the aforementioned reliance on the Ferrer hypothesis and analogies to mystery cults. However, I was challenged to look at his calculations of posterior probability of a historical Jesus and to do my own. I have decided to accept that challenge, but before getting to those calculations, it's prudent to explain why I object to Dr. Carrier's calculations to prior probability, the impact on the prior probability has on the posterior probability, and what alterations I have made and why I have made them. So, what is the basis for Dr. Carrier's prior probability? Carrier's prior probability depends heavily on assumptions that are influenced by hypotheses such as Mark and priority and the Ferrer hypothesis. Here's a deeper look into how these presumptions impact his Bayesian calculations. Mark and priority. Dr. Carrier assumes that the Gospel of Mark was the earliest of the canonical Gospels and that the other synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, use Mark as a source. This assumption is critical because he views Mark as largely mythological and composed with a theological rather than a historical agenda. By placing Mark at the forefront of gospel tradition, Dr. Carrier argues that subsequent gospel narratives are more likely to be elaborations or embellishments rather than independent, reliable historical attestations. This affects the consequent probability assigned to the gospels as evidence for historicity. The Ferrer hypothesis. Dr. Carrier's acceptance of the Ferrer hypothesis, which posits that Luke used both Mark and Matthew as sources, rejecting the existence of the hypothetical Q source, supports his view that the Gospels are interconnected and not based on multiple independent traditions. By reducing the perceived independence of the Gospels, this hypothesis further lowers the reliability of Gospel accounts as corroborative evidence for the historical Jesus, which in turn affects the overall calculation of prior probability. Impact on prior probability. The use of rank-Raglan hero class as a basis for estimating the prior probability of Jesus' historicity is influenced by the mythological and literary analysis of Gospel of Mark. Dr. Carrier argues that Jesus shares many traits with mythological heroes, which suggests a lower prior probability of historicity. The reliance on Mark and priority and the Ferrer hypothesis reinforces the idea that the Gospels are primarily myth-making rather than historical records, which is integral to how Dr. Carrier sets his priors. Interdependence of sources. Dr. Carrier also emphasizes the interdependence of the Gospels. If these texts are not independent witnesses to historical events, but instead build upon and elaborate each other's accounts, then their value as evidence for historicity diminishes significantly. This is why Dr. Carrier's calculation of prior probabilities gives substantial weight to literary and mythological analyses. Criticisms and counterarguments. Critics of Dr. Carrier's approach might argue that assumptions like Mark and priority and the Ferrer hypothesis are not universally accepted, and that alternative models such as the two-source hypothesis or a more historically reliable view of the Gospels would yield different priors. Furthermore, the degree to which mythical elements in the Gospels imply non-historicity remains contested among scholars. To analyze how rejecting Dr. Carrier's presumptions, market priority, and the Ferrer hypothesis in favor of two-source hypothesis, which includes the existence of a hypothetical Q source, would impact his Bayesian calculations, we can consider several factors. Number one, increased apparent independence of the sources. According to the two-source hypothesis, if we accept the existence of Q and believe that both Matthew and Luke use Q and Mark independently, this increases the apparent independence of the gospel accounts. This assumption would suggest that the narratives about Jesus are not heavily reliant on a single tradition, i.e. Mark, but instead come from multiple independent streams of tradition. Impact on prior probability. Dr. Carrier's prior probability of Jesus' historicity would likely increase under this hypothesis. The reasoning is that more independent sources are generally taken as stronger evidence for the historical existence of a person or event. Thus, if Q represents an independent tradition about Jesus that predates the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, it adds weight to the argument for historicity. 2. Reevaluation of mythical elements. Mythical traits in Q. Dr. Carey's method relies heavily on the assumption that the Gospels, especially Mark, are mythological constructs. If the two-source hypothesis introduces Q as a more primitive, potentially sayings-oriented and less mythologized tradition, it would weaken the argument that all Gospel material is derived from Markan mythologizing. Effect on mythicism. The existence of Q would imply that at least some teachings attributed to Jesus were circulated in a form that might be closer to the historical Jesus. This would reduce the strength of the claim that the entire Jesus narrative is a later mythical creation. 3. Consequent probabilities adjustments. Q as evidence. With Q treated as an independent source, the consequent probability, the likelihood of observing the evidence we have if Jesus were historical, would increase. The reason is that Q would be seen as an independent confirmation of Jesus' sayings and activities, which would make the existence of Jesus more plausible. As a result, Dr. Carey's calculated probability of Jesus' historicity would become higher. Prior probability adjustments. The likelihood of observing the evidence if we have Jesus were a mythical figure might also change. If Q is considered a genuine independent tradition, it would be harder to argue that all evidence is explicable by mythicism, thus decreasing the likelihood. 4. Shifting the rank-Raglan argument. Mythic archetypes versus historical roots. Dr. Carey's use of rank-Raglan hero classification depends on Jesus sharing characteristics with mythical figures. However, if Q predates Mark and lacks many of these mythic hero traits, then the argument that Jesus fits into a well-established pattern of mythic heroes becomes less compelling. This would weaken the justification for a low prior probability. Impact on rank-Raglan prior. The prior probability derived from Jesus fitting the rank-Raglan archetype would need to be adjusted, likely upward, reflecting the potential historical core that Q represents. 5. Overall impact on Bayesian calculations. By introducing Q as an earlier potential independent source, the combined effect would likely be an increase in the overall probability of Jesus' historicity. Dr. Carey's method, which is sensitive to the independence of reliability of sources, would yield a different result if Q significantly changes the evidentiary landscape. Specifically, the prior probability would increase and the consequent probability would be more favorable. The net result would be a higher posterior probability that Jesus existed historically. Therefore, if the two-source hypothesis with Q is more accurate than the Ferrer hypothesis, Dr. Carey's low prior probability would be difficult to defend. The mythicist argument would be weaker, as the increased independence and less mythologized nature of Q would provide stronger support for historical Jesus. This shift in assumptions could make the historicist position more credible and push the Bayesian conclusion toward a higher probability of Jesus' existence. Dr. Carey justifies his preference for the Ferrer hypothesis over the two-source hypothesis primarily based on the principle of parsimony, Occam's razor, and his assessment of the evidence concerning literary dependence among synoptic gospels. Here's a summary of how Carey argues in favor of the Ferrer hypothesis. Number 1, simpler explanation of literary dependence. Occam's razor. Dr. Carey argues that the Ferrer hypothesis is more parsimonious because it does not require the existence of a hypothetical Q source. Instead, it explains the double tradition, material found in both Matthew and Luke but not in Mark, by proposing that Luke used Matthew as a source. This eliminates the need to posit a lost document, which has never been found and remains speculative. Direct literary relationship. He suggests that the evidence of redaction and literary dependence in the Gospel is better explained if Luke had direct access to Matthew alongside Mark, rather than both authors independently using Mark and Q. 2. Challenges to the existence of Q. Lack of manuscript evidence. Dr. Carey points out that there is no direct manuscript evidence of a Q source, which weakens the case for its existence. He views the hypothetical nature of Q as a liability for the two-source hypothesis. Redaction criticism. He believes that the patterns of redaction in Luke are more easily explained if Luke had access to Matthew. For example, certain changes Luke makes to material found in Matthew are, in Dr. Carrier's view, more consistent with Luke's use of Matthew as a source rather than drawing both of them from Q independently. 3. Issues with Q's hypothetical content. Speculative reconstructions. Dr. Carrier criticizes the way Q has been reconstructed by scholars, noting that there is considerable debate about its content, redaction history, and whether it was even coherent written source or an oral tradition. This ambiguity makes the hypothesis less compelling to him. 4. Consistency in explaining gospel composition. Streamlined model. The Ferrer hypothesis provides a streamlined explanation for the composition of synoptic gospels by suggesting a linear development. Mark leads to Matthew, leads to Luke. Dr. Carrier finds this model appealing because it accounts for the observed data without invoking additional unproven sources. But his appeal to parsimony collapses in the face of the criterion of unnecessary variation. 1. Dr. Carrier's appeal to parsimony. Dr. Carrier prefers the Ferrer hypothesis largely because it is simpler and more straightforward. It does not require positing a lost Q source, thereby adhering to Occam's razor. In other words, by suggesting that Luke used both Mark and Matthew as sources, the Ferrer hypothesis simplifies the relationship between the synoptic gospels and avoids invoking an extra speculative document. 2. The criterion of unnecessary variation. This criterion states that if a hypothesis introduces unnecessary complexity or variations without a clear purpose, it becomes less plausible. The two-source hypothesis, while introducing the additional Q source, explains the independent traditions found in Matthew and Luke more coherently. In contrast, the Ferrer hypothesis must account for why Luke, if he had access to Matthew, introduces significant narrative complexities and variations. For example, Luke's use of unique material, for example, the nativity story with the census, and rearrangement of shared material without clear motivation creates unnecessary variations that complicate the narrative rather than simplify it. How does this affect Dr. Carrier's argument? Well, there's a collapse of parsimony. Dr. Carrier's appeal to parsimony under Ferrer hypothesis is weaker when faced with the criteria of unnecessary variation. If Luke had direct access to Matthew, why would he introduce complex unnecessary differences that do not streamline or clarify the narrative? This undermines the supposed simplicity of the Ferrer hypothesis. Support for the two-source hypothesis. The two-source hypothesis better explains these variations by positing that Matthew and Luke independently drew from Mark and Q, or an oral tradition, the two-source hypothesis for the differences in narrative content and arrangement for stemming from separate authorial intents and sources rather than inexplicable editorial sources. That is to say, when presented with these variations, he is forced to make new assumptions based on appeal to motivation. When confronted with these unexplained variations in the Gospel of Luke that complicate the narrative, Carrier and proponents of the Ferrer hypothesis are often compelled to make additional assumptions to account for them. This reliance on speculative appeals to motivations of the authors undermines the original appeal of parsimony and weakens the overall strength of the Ferrer hypothesis. So how does this play out? Assumptions about Luke's motivations. To explain why Luke would introduce complex variations and changes to material found in Matthew, proponents of the Ferrer hypothesis must speculate about Luke's motives. These appeals can involve claims that Luke sought to emphasize certain theological points, appeal to a different audience, or to make editorial decisions for stylistic reasons. Such explanations, however, lack concrete evidence and introduce new speculative elements into the argument. They are not as straightforward as the original claim of simplicity and often feel forced or ad hoc. 2. Loss of parsimony. The strength of the Ferrer hypothesis hinges on its simplicity. It aims to explain the synoptic problem without invoking a hypothetical Q source. However, once a hypothesis requires these additional assumptions about Luke's motivations, it no longer holds the same parsimony. The criterion of unnecessary variation demonstrates that the variations in Luke's gospel are not easily explained by a simple linear literary independence on Matthew. Instead, they suggest influent independent sources or traditions, which is better accounted for by the two-source hypothesis. 3. The two-source hypothesis as a more plausible explanation. The two-source hypothesis can naturally accommodate these variations without needing to speculate about the motivations of the authors. By proposing that Matthew and Luke drew from Mark and an independent Q source, the hypothesis allows for the differences in content and structures to arise from distinct sources rather than unexplained editorial choices. Thus, Dr. Carrier's reliance on the Ferrer hypothesis requires him to make speculative appeals to authorial motivation when faced with variations that do not align with the narrative simplicity one would expect if Luke were merely redacting Matthew. These appeals introduce new assumptions which erode the Ferrer hypothesis' claim to parsimony and make the two-source hypothesis appear to be more robust and verisimilar. And even then, the presumed theological motivation doesn't sufficiently explain some variation, and in fact, such a presumption worsens in some instances, such as the Nazareth detail. Even when proponents of the Ferrer hypothesis invoke presumed theological motivations to explain variations between Matthew and Luke, these explanations often fall short and in some cases exacerbate the problem. The Nazareth detail is a particularly strong example where such a presumption fails to adequately account for the complexity of the narrative. The Nazareth detail and a theological motivation. Matthew and Luke's different approaches. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' association with Nazareth is introduced to fulfill a prophecy, Matthew 2:23. But as discussed earlier, there is no clear Old Testament prophecy stating that the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. This already creates a narrative complication that requires explanation. In the Gospel of Luke, the narrative goes even further, introducing the census under Kaiser Augustus as a device to explain how Jesus, who was otherwise associated with Nazareth, was born in Bethlehem in line with the prophecy from Micah 5:2. This adds a layer of complexity to the narrative. 2. Theological motivation argument. To justify these variations, the Ferrer hypothesis opponents must argue that Luke had specific theological reasons for altering or expanding on Matthew's narrative. For instance, they might suggest that Luke wanted to emphasize Jesus' Davidic lineage or to make a theological point about Jesus' humble origins. However, this explanation is insufficient because it doesn't clarify why Luke would create such an elaborate and convoluted story involving a census and a journey rather than simply adopting or modifying Matthew's simpler explanation. If the goal was theological, there would be easier ways to make the point without complicating the narrative. How theological presumptions worsen the problem. 1. The Nazareth and Bethlehem complication. The Nazareth detail is particularly problematic because from a theological standpoint, it makes more sense for the gospel writers to keep Jesus' birthplace in Bethlehem, fulfilling the explicit prophecy in Micah 5:2, without introducing Nazareth as his hometown. The inclusion of Nazareth introduces an unnecessary narrative challenge. If Luke were merely redacting Matthew, it's hard to understand why he would feel compelled to complicate the story. The theological presumption that Luke had specific motives fails to make sense of why he wouldn't streamline the narrative or simplify the narrative. 2. Increase complexity as a weakness. Instead of simplifying the narrative to align to existing messianic prophecies, the gospel writers preserve Jesus' association with Nazareth despite the lack of a clear prophetic basis. This complicates the argument that they were motivated purely by theological concerns, as a fictional or fabricated story would more likely avoid such unnecessary difficulties. This adds weight to the idea that the gospel writers were constrained by pre-existing traditions or historical realities that they had to incorporate, even if doing so made the narrative more complex. This invocation of Parashim means that the mythicist is obliged to presume, without justification, that Matthew 2:23 refers to Isaiah. However, since that won't work with a straightforward reading of the text, the mythicist must also presume, without justification, that the author of Matthew was reliant on a pun for his theology. Therefore, the presumed theological motivations used to justify the variations in the Ferrer hypothesis often do not sufficiently explain the narrative complexities in the Gospels. In fact, such presumptions can worsen the case for the Ferrer hypothesis, as seen with the Nazareth detail, where the narrative complexity contradicts the notion of a simple theological motive. This further strengthens the case for the two-source hypothesis, which better accounts for the independent and complex traditions surrounding Jesus. So which hypothesis is better? Among scholars of New Testament studies, the two-source hypothesis, which posits the existence of a hypothetical Q source used by both Matthew and Luke alongside Mark, continues to enjoy wider support than the Ferrer hypothesis. Here's an overview of where current scholarly consensus stands. Number 1, the two-source hypothesis, or the Q hypothesis. Broad acceptance. The two-source hypothesis remains the dominant model among scholars. It argues that Matthew and Luke independently use both Mark and a second source, Q, which is thought to be a collection of Jesus' sayings. This hypothesis has been a foundational theory in New Testament studies since the late 19th century. Scholarly support. Many biblical scholars support this hypothesis because it explains the double tradition material found in both Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, effectively, and accounts for the significant differences in narrative structure and content between Matthew and Luke. Arguments in favor. Proponents argue that Q helps explain the shared but non-Markan content in Matthew and Luke, as well as the independence of these Gospels. They also point to literary and thematic analysis suggesting a shared but distinct source. 2. The Ferrer hypothesis. Growing interest. Although the Ferrer hypothesis is less widely accepted, it has gained some scholarly traction, particularly in recent decades. This hypothesis holds that Luke used both Mark and Matthew as sources, eliminating the need for Q. Key advocates. The Ferrer hypothesis, championed by notable scholars such as Mark Goodacre, who argues that Luke's use of Matthew is a more straightforward explanation that avoids the hypothetical and unproven nature of Q. Goodacre and others suggest that literary dependence on Luke on Matthew makes more sense in terms of redactional criticism and narrative development. Arguments in favor. Advocates highlight the simplicity of the Ferrer hypothesis, which does not require a lost written source Q, and argues for a more direct literary relationship between the Gospels. 3. Current scholarly consensus. The two-source hypothesis still enjoys greater support among scholars and is considered the standard explanation in mainstream New Testament studies. However, the Ferrer hypothesis is a respected minority position and is increasingly discussed and debated. Scholarly conferences and publications continue to engage with both hypotheses, with some scholars proposing nuanced variations or alternative models. Reasons for continued support of the Q hypothesis include explanatory power. The Q hypothesis explains the similarities between Matthew and Luke without postulating direct dependence, which fits well with the idea of multiple independent traditions about Jesus. Complexity of redaction. Scholars who support Q argue that Luke's redaction of Matthew, as proposed by the Ferrer hypothesis, would be unnecessarily complex and is more plausible that both drew from a common source. In short, while the two-source hypothesis remains the preferred explanation in the field, there is growing interest in the Ferrer hypothesis. The debate continues, and new arguments and evidence could potentially shift the scholarly landscape in the future. However, as it stands, the existence of Q, whether as a manuscript or an oral tradition, continues to have stronger support. So let's calculate the verisimilitudes of each hypothesis. The issues arising from the criterion of unnecessary variation, as previously elucidated, have a profound impact on the prior probabilities when comparing the two-source hypothesis and the Ferrer hypothesis. Let's break down how these factors influence the priors in terms of comparative verisimilitude of these two hypotheses. The priors are influenced by the plausibility of each hypothesis in explaining the observed complexity and apparent historical constraints present in the gospel narratives. 1. Nazareth and the Bethlehem complexity. The two-source hypothesis gains plausibility if we consider the gospel writers were constrained by existing traditions or sources that associated Jesus with Nazareth and Bethlehem. The hypothesis allows the possibility that Matthew and Luke had access to traditions about Jesus that were not derived from Mark, possibly explaining why they would both feel compelled to address Jesus' Davidic lineage and birthplace while also dealing with his association with Nazareth. The Ferrer hypothesis is less effective at explaining this complexity. If Luke was simply borrowing from Matthew, one would expect a more straightforward harmonization or a simplified narrative. Instead, the fact that Luke introduces additional details, like the census, to account for Jesus' birth in Bethlehem suggests that Luke was working with independent traditions or sources, which complicates the Ferrer hypothesis. Two, archaeological evidence for Nazareth. The archaeological evidence supporting Nazareth's existence in the first century lends credibility to the notion that Jesus was associated with a real place, making the historicist explanation more plausible. This evidence supports the idea that gospel writers were constrained by a known historical location, which they had to then integrate into their narratives, rather than inventing it purely for theological purposes. For the two-source hypothesis, this evidence strengthens the case that a Q, whether be written or oral, could have preserved traditions about Jesus that included his association with Nazareth, independent of Mark. For the Ferrer hypothesis, this archaeological support doesn't add much, since the hypothesis focuses on literary dependence and doesn't provide a clear explanation for why Luke would complicate the narrative if he were simply expanding on Matthew's account. 3. The criterion of unnecessary variation. The two-source hypothesis is better at accommodating the criterion of unnecessary variation. If Matthew and Luke were independently using Mark and Q or some other oral traditions, it makes sense why they would introduce distinct yet related details about Jesus' birth and association with Nazareth. The unnecessary narrative complexity, like the census, suggests that these authors were not inventing details freely, but were instead constrained by earlier sources or traditions. The Ferrer hypothesis, on the other hand, must explain why Luke would go to such lengths to add complexity if he was primarily using Matthew. If Luke's goal was to simply elaborate on Matthew, the addition of a convoluted census narrative seems unnecessary, reducing the verisimilitude of the Ferrer hypothesis. 4. The James, brother of the Lord issue. Another issue with which mythicists must contend is the fact that Jesus is held to have earthly siblings. A straightforward reading of Galatians 5:19, which is held within academia to be an authentic Pauline text, a straightforward reading of 1 Corinthians 9:5, which is also held to be a genuine Pauline text, straightforward readings of Matthew 12:46 and 13:55, Mark 6:3, John 2:12, John 7:3, John 7:5, John 7:10, and Acts 1:14, and a straightforward readings of Antiquities 29:1, for which the scholarly consensus is that is an authentic text from Josephus, all serve to corroborate the existence of an earthly family of Jesus, and even given Markan priority, these familial relationships are present in early Christian tradition and are supported by extra-biblical evidence. The mythicist exegesis will not allow this, which obliges mythicists to 1. Presume that the Pauline reference referred to some spiritual fraternity rather than a literal blood relation. 2. Presume that the other biblical references were later developments in the Christian tradition that were also fabricated. And 3. Presume that the reference from Josephus is a later forgery. There is no empirical evidence to support any of those presumptions. Based on the evidence and the complexity of the narratives, we can now look at adjusting the priors. The two-source hypothesis. The prior probability for the two-source hypothesis should be increased, as it better accounts for the independent traditions and the necessity of dealing with historical details like Nazareth and Bethlehem. The existence of Q or other similar oral traditions adds explanatory power, making this hypothesis more verisimile. Alternatively, the Ferrer hypothesis, the prior probability for the Ferrer hypothesis, should be decreased or at least viewed with more skepticism. The hypothesis struggles to explain the unnecessary narrative complexity and the independent traditions implied by the gospel accounts. When comparing the two-source and Ferrer hypotheses, the two-source hypothesis has greater verisimilitude in light of the complexities of the nativity narrative and the association with Nazareth and the archaeological evidence supporting Nazareth's existence. It provides a more coherent explanation for why the gospel writers would introduce specific details and complexities. The Ferrer hypothesis appears less verisimilar as it relies on a simpler model of literary dependence that does not adequately account for the independence of the elements or the need for the narrative complexity observed in Luke. The analysis supports the view that the two-source hypothesis is more plausible and should have a higher prior probability when assessing the origins of the gospel narratives. The cumulative evidence, especially the need to account for Jesus' association with Nazareth and the Bethlehem prophecy, tilts the balance in favor of the two-source hypothesis. This comparative analysis highlights how historical, archaeological, and narrative evidence can influence our assessment of competing theories. So, which came first, the myth or the man? Dr. Carrier addresses the dynamic between the historicized mythological figures, or HMF, versus mythologized historical figures, MHF, by illustrating how historical figures were often embellished with mythological elements in ancient literature. Here's a breakdown of his approach. Ehumerization. Dr. Carey discusses the process of ehumerization, where mythological figures were transformed into historical characters. He uses examples like Plutarch's biography of Romulus, where Plutarch wrote about Romulus as if he were a historical figure, even though Romulus was originally a mythological entity, created to serve specific cultural and ideological purposes. This biography was written alongside those of genuine historical figures like Alexander the Great, with little distinction in the narrative style, creating the impression that Romulus was as historical as any real person. Cultural and ideological function. Dr. Carrier argues that myths like that of Romulus were historicized to provide historical heroes and moral exemplars for society. These figures were used to convey values and unity, and the myth was repackaged as history to give authority and credibility to the underlying message. Alternatively, if we're looking at mythologized historical figures, there is rapid legendary development. Dr. Carrier provides examples of historical figures who were quickly acquired legendary status, such as Alexander the Great and Augustus. Miraculous stories and divine attributes were often appended to these figures, sometimes even within their lifetimes, demonstrating how historical persons could become mythologized rapidly to serve the purposes of veneration or propaganda. Symbolic narrative. Dr. Carrier suggests that even if historical figures existed, the accounts about them in ancient texts are often embellished with mythical elements to communicate deeper symbolic meanings rather than to provide factual history. This is evident in how stories are adjusted or reversed to reflect contemporary values, such as Virgil did in the Aeneid by recasting Homeric tales with Roman values. 3. The Gospels as a case study. Dr. Carrier applies this concept to the Gospels, arguing that even if Jesus were a historical figure, the narratives surrounding him might still be mythologized. He emphasizes that the Gospels contain elements of consistent myth, such as allusion to Old Testament stories and patterns from other myths, suggesting that they were crafted for theological and symbolic purposes rather than as straightforward historical accounts. Challenge to historicity. This perspective supports his broader argument that historicity of Jesus is uncertain. Even if some elements of Jesus' life were based on a historical person, the extent of mythologization makes it difficult to extract reliable historical facts from the narratives. Therefore, we can see Dr. Carrier's work illustrates that the boundary between myth and history was often blurred in antiquity. Myths were routinely historicized to serve social or religious purposes, while historical figures were often mythologized to enhance their significance. This understanding informs his argument that the stories of Jesus might similarly be more myth than history, especially in a context where the creation and embellishment of sacred narratives were common practices. However, this understanding informs his argument may lead to bias. So how does Dr. Carrier account for this? Dr. Carrier accounts for the dynamic between historicized mythological figures and mythologized historical figures in his Bayesian calculation as follows. 1. Impact on prior probability. Mythological archetypes. Dr. Carrier uses the rank-Raglan hero archetype to estimate the prior probability that Jesus was a historical figure. This archetype includes mythological figures who were later historicized. By demonstrating that Jesus shares numerous features with these mythological heroes, Dr. Carrier argues that the prior probability of Jesus being a purely historical figure is lower. This approach reflects his consideration of how often mythological figures in antiquity were presented as historical. Comparison to historical and mythical figures. Dr. Carrier contrasts figures with figures like Romulus, a likely historicized myth, with others like Socrates, a real person who was later mythologized. He uses these examples to establish a baseline for estimating how often similar figures were turned out to be mythological or historicized, informing his prior probability assessment. 2. Influence on consequent probabilities. Likelihood of based on evidence. When assessing the likelihood of observing the gospel content, if Jesus were historical or mythical, Dr. Carrier incorporates the way ancient literature often blends myth with history. He argues that the presence of mythical elements, such as miracles, fulfilled prophecies, and symbolic narratives, aligns more with how myths were presented as history rather than with how genuine biographies of historical figures were written. Accounting for legendary development. Dr. Carrier acknowledges that historical figures could be mythologized over time, but he weighs against the degree and speed of mythologization observed in the Jesus narratives. He suggests that the Gospel's heavy reliance on symbolism and typology makes them more akin to mythologized constructs than to sober accounts of a historical figure. 3. Explicit integration into Bayesian model. Prior probability adjustments. Dr. Carrier explicitly adjusts the prior probability based on the frequency with which figures matching the rank-Raglan criteria turn out to be mythological rather than historical. He sets this prior probability low, around 0.33 or lower, to reflect the prevalence of mythological figures being historicized given the data that he considers. Evidential assessment. For the consequent probabilities, Dr. Carrier evaluates how well the existing evidence fits a historical versus a mythological hypothesis. He takes into account the literary and mythological elements within the Gospels, arguing that these figures are more likely to be present if Jesus were a mythological figure rather than a historical one. In summary, Dr. Carrier integrates the distinction between historicized myths and mythologized historical figures into his Bayesian analysis. He uses this understanding to shape both the priors and the likelihoods, making his calculations reflect the complexities of ancient narrative practices. His approach is designed to quantify the degree to which mythological and historical blending affects our ability to assess the historicity of Jesus. Dr. Carrier does not, however, take into account the ratio of known historical figures later mythologized versus mythological figures later historicized into his account directly. Dr. Carrier does not express this relationship as a numerical ratio in the book, but instead uses examples and general frequency trends to guide his analysis. He implies that while both processes were frequent in antiquity, the historicization of mythological figures is particularly relevant when assessing the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus, given the extensive mythological motifs present in those texts. If we were to estimate a hypothetical ratio based on Dr. Carrier's examples and reasoning, the historicization of entirely mythological figures like Romulus appears to be less frequent in the historical record than the embellishment of real historical figures with mythic elements like Alexander the Great. However, the figures that do fall into the category of historicized myths are significant and culturally influential, which amplifies their importance in Dr. Carrier's argument. Thus, while at precise numerical ratio isn't provided, Dr. Kerr's Bayesian framework hinges on the idea of the historization of a mythological figure is common enough to warrant a low prior probability for Jesus' historicity, given the parallels between Jesus and other mythical heroes. This mythologization of historical figures is acknowledged but viewed as less relevant for completely undermining the historicity of a person. However, given that the mythologization of historical figures is demonstrably far more prevalent, this view is disputable. The analysis should take into account the fact that while embellishment of historical figures with mythic elements is more frequent in the historical record, the complete historization of entirely mythological figures occurs less often. This consideration should be prudently reflected in the Bayesian model, particularly in setting of prior probabilities. Implications. The more widespread support of the two-source hypothesis. The two-source hypothesis continues to be more widely accepted among scholars for explaining the synoptic gospels. This is due to its ability to account for the shared material between Matthew and Luke that is not present in Mark, and the idea that an independent Q source provides a more plausible explanation for these similarities. Greater verisimilitude of the two-source hypothesis. The two-source hypothesis has greater verisimilitude compared to the Ferrer hypothesis because it better explains the complexities and narrative details present in the Gospels, such as variations in the narratives that serve no purpose for a completely fictional character. The two-source hypothesis accommodates independent traditions that the Ferrer hypothesis does not adequately explain. This brings us to the justification for reevaluating the Bayesian calculations using the two-source hypothesis. Given the two-source hypothesis' stronger scholarly support and higher verisimilitude, it is reasonable to justify it in reevaluating the Bayesian calculations using the two-source hypothesis instead of the Ferrer hypothesis. This reevaluation would better reflect a more accurate representation of the data and scholarly consensus. Incorporating the historical mythologized figures into the ratio. The greater frequency of historical figures now being mythologized compared to mythological figures being historicized supports adjusting the Bayesian prior probabilities. Incorporating this ratio ensures a more nuanced and balanced analysis, further strengthening the case for historicity. With all of the preceding in mind, we can now move forward to recalculating the posterior probability of a historical Jesus. Bayes' theorem is given in the form of the formula that is shown on the screen now, where the factors taken into account are the posterior probability that Jesus existed given the evidence, the likelihood of the evidence if Jesus existed, the prior probability of Jesus' historicity, and the normalizing constant, which ensures the total probability adds up to 1. We can now focus on calculating the adjusted prior and the new likelihoods. Recall that under Dr. Carrier's model, establishing his prior probability, Jesus fits many of the criteria of the rank-Raglan mythic hero class, which Dr. Carrier argues implies a lower prior probability for historicity. Dr. Carrier considers the historical trend where mythological figures are sometimes historicized, assigning a conservative prior of 0.33. Based on the assumption that many elements in Jesus' narrative have parallels in mythological tradition, Dr. Carrier sets a relatively low prior probability. Under the new model establishing the prior probability using the two-source hypothesis, the hypothesis posits that both Matthew and Luke had access to independent sources, Mark and Q, or oral traditions, which implies a more plausible historical basis. The higher frequency of real historical figures being mythologized compared to purely mythological figures being historicized increases the prior probability. Strong supporting evidence for Nazareth's existence in the first century adds weight to the historicist hypothesis, as does the multiple references to Jesus' earthly siblings. And finally, given these factors, the prior probability is raised to reflect the increased plausibility and historicity, which brings us to these new figures. So let's talk about them. The original calculation by Dr. Carrier uses a low prior probability of 0.33, reflecting skepticism about Jesus' historicity. The revised calculation raises this to 0.55, justified by the two-source hypothesis and the higher likelihood of historical figures being mythologized. Dr. Carrier assigned a neutral likelihood of 0.5. The new analysis increases this to 0.85, reflecting stronger evidence from independent traditions and archaeological findings. Dr. Carrier also uses 0.5 for the non-historicity of Jesus, and the new analysis lowers this to 0.2, indicating that the mythicist explanation is less plausible given the evidence. Finally, the posterior probability. Dr. Carrier's posterior probability was 32.3%, while the new analysis gives a significantly higher probability of 83.8% for Jesus' historicity. In conclusion, the more widespread support and greater verisimilitude of the two-source hypothesis versus the Ferrer hypothesis, and the greater prevalence of historical figures being mythologized versus mythological people being historicized, justifies the respective incorporation into Bayesian analysis for the question of historical Jesus versus a purely fictional Jesus. The inclusion of these factors increases the prior probability of Jesus' historicity from Dr. Carrier's 0.33 to a 0.85. And this, by extension, raises the posterior probability of a historical Jesus who is later mythologized from Dr. Carrier's 0.323 or 32.3% to 0.838 or 83.8% under the updated model. This does not guarantee that a historical Jesus definitely did exist, nor is intended to. However, it should demonstrate that it does serve as an inference to the best explanation due to the hypotheses' respective verisimilitudes. At the very least, it ought to illustrate the profound role that presumptions play in such assessments and the significant impact that such assumptions can have on the results. Essentially, starting with the conclusion and working backward is like shooting an arrow at the wall and then painting a target around it.